In the summer of 1876, deep in the wilderness of Montana, a lone doctor rode through the pine forests toward a cabin that locals whispered about but never approached. The call had been urgent, a woman in labor, complications expected. When he pushed open the cabin door, the air was heavy with heat, smoke, and silence. A young mother lay on a blood-soaked cot, her body trembling with exhaustion. In the dim light of a single oil lamp, the doctor could see the faces of the family around her, expressionless, unmoving, as if this birth was not a moment of life, but a ritual they had witnessed too many times before. Moments later, the sound of newborn cries filled the room, two voices, weak and uneven. But then, just as suddenly, came a silence so absolute it made the doctor's heart stop. When he looked down, he saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Twin infants, joined at the chest, breathing in fragile unison. The family did not gasp or weep. They simply stared, cold and resigned, as though they had expected this. What began that night as a desperate medical emergency would soon unravel into one of America's most disturbing genetic mysteries, a secret that had survived 5 generations of inbreeding, hidden experiments, and quiet murder. This is the story of the Donnelly family, and the century-long experiment they believed would create human perfection. To understand how this nightmare began, we have to go back to the old country Ireland, 1790. Before we go any further, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a chapter. Now let's back to our story. To trace the Donnelly family's nightmare, we must begin far from Montana, across the ocean in Ireland during the late 18th century. It was a time when the land was green, but the hearts of its people were starving. Long before the Great Famine, rural Ireland was already gripped by poverty, superstition, and a fierce devotion to God. Villages whispered of curses, miracles, and bloodlines that carried both blessings and doom. In a small county near Kilkenny, a man named Fergus Donnelly was born into this world of hunger and faith. By all accounts, he was brilliant, a self-taught scholar who read Latin scriptures by candlelight and studied the breeding of livestock with obsessive precision. But intelligence can twist, and Fergus's curiosity soon turned into something darker. He began to believe that the same principles used to breed stronger animals could be applied to people. The perfect cow, the perfect horse? Why not the perfect human? In his mind, it wasn't arrogance, it was divine duty. Fergus became convinced that God had chosen the Irish as a superior race, a people whose purity had been diluted by centuries of mixing and oppression. He saw himself as the man who could restore that perfection through selective breeding within his own bloodline. So when he married his cousin Maura, the villagers only whispered what they dared not say aloud, that this union was not of love, but of design. Fergus spoke of it openly, calling it a holy experiment. He believed that every generation would bring him closer to divine perfection, flesh purified through devotion, intellect, and blood. At first, the results seemed ordinary. The children were healthy, strong, and sharp-minded. Fergus took it as proof that he was right, that God had blessed his vision. But nature does not bend to man's ambition, and soon the cracks began to show. The Donnelly line had been set on a path that no prayer could redeem, a lineage where faith and madness would intertwine for generations. And when famine finally came to Ireland, it wasn't just the crops that began to rot, it was the family's soul. As Ireland's fields withered and hunger swept through the land, the Donnelly name became a curse whispered in the dark. By the 1840s, famine had reduced entire villages to ghost towns, and rumors of Fergus Donnelly's experiments spread like disease. When a midwife reported a malformed stillbirth in the Donnelly home, the church began asking questions. Fergus's son, Patrick Donnelly, knew what that meant. The family's secret could no longer survive under the church's eye. Under the cover of night, Patrick gathered what little they owned, a few trunks, a wooden chest filled with papers, and a worn crucifix. and fled. His wife, Bridge, carried their only surviving child as they boarded a ship bound for America. For 6 weeks they endured the Atlantic, sickness, hunger, and death surrounding them. By the time they reached New York, Patrick's face had aged 10 years, and the child who had survived the voyage would never learn to speak. But America, to the Donnellys, was not a land of freedom. It was a clean slate, an untouched canvas on which to continue Fergus's vision. Patrick was convinced his father's mission had only failed because of interference. Priests, doctors, outsiders who corrupted God's plan. In America, there would be no one to interfere, so the family kept moving west, farther and farther from civilization. By 1860, they had vanished into the Montana frontier, a place so remote that mail took months to arrive, and no one asked where you came from. There, among the pine-covered ridges near the Bitterroot Mountains, the Donnellys built a cabin. They raised livestock, grew potatoes, and kept to themselves. To the rare traveler who passed through, they were quiet, polite, and strangely educated for backwoods settlers. But inside that cabin, another kind of record was being kept. Patrick had inherited not only Fergus's obsession, but his meticulousness. In a locked chest he kept journals, thick books filled with family trees, medical notes, and sketches of faces. There were drawings of infants, some normal, some not. Margins filled with words like variation, reversion, divine correction. Each birth was logged, measured and analyzed as if it were part of a grand experiment. Bridge, once a schoolteacher, played her part too. She wrote in careful script, recording every detail of pregnancies, deformities, and deaths. The cabin was a home, but it was also a laboratory, built not from science, but from delusion and faith. Locals who stumbled upon their homestead noticed strange things, crosses carved into trees, small mounds of earth behind the cabin marked only by stones, and the distant cries of children that never seemed to grow older. When asked about the graves, Patrick would simply say, "God takes what he does not perfect." By the time the Civil War had ended, the Donnellys had become ghosts in their own land, isolated, breeding within their own bloodline. Their journals growing thicker each year. They weren't just farmers. They were record keepers of lives created and destroyed in the name of purity, and buried beneath those Montana hills were the silent results of a dream that should never have been born. By the summer of 1876, the Montana wilderness was suffocating in heat. Pine needles crackled underfoot, the air thick with the scent of sap and smoke from distant wildfires. For days, a storm had been threatening to break but never did. It was in that heavy silence that Dr. Alistair Brennan, a young physician from Helena, received a desperate message scratched in shaky handwriting. "Child coming wrong. Send help. Donnelly Cabin, North Ridge." Brennan was new to the frontier, a man of science from Vienna, trained in modern medicine but drawn to America's wild promise. He packed his instruments, mounted his horse, and rode through a maze of trees and shadow until he reached a clearing where the Donnelly cabin stood, a slanted structure of grey timber, half swallowed by the forest. The first thing he noticed was the smell, iron, sweat, and something faintly sour beneath it. The door creaked open without a sound. Inside, a single oil lamp flickered, throwing long shadows on the walls. A woman lay on a cot, pale and trembling. Her name was Moira Donnelly, no more than 20, her hair plastered to her face. Around her stood 3 men and an older woman, silent, motionless, watching him. "Step aside," Brennan ordered softly, setting down his bag. But they didn't move. Their faces were calm, almost rehearsed. Finally, the old woman, Bridge Donnelly, matriarch and midwife, nodded once and said, "You'll do what God allows, doctor." When Brennan examined the mother, he realized why they had called for help. The child, no children, were coming together. Hours passed in the stifling heat. The only sounds, Moira's labored breath and the distant hum of insects outside. Then came the moment, 2 infant cries, thin and uneven. Brennan looked down, expecting relief, and froze. The twins were joined at the chest, their small bodies trembling in unison, breaths shallow and syncopated. The room remained utterly still. Brennan's pulse raced as he reached for a cloth, instinctively trying to separate them. But Bridge placed a hand on his wrist and whispered, "Don't! They were meant to be so." That was when Brennan truly looked at the family. Not one of them showed shock or grief. They had seen this before. They didn't fear it. They expected it. After the birth, Brennan stepped outside to breathe, but the night air brought no relief. He could see small shapes in the dirt behind the cabin, stone-marked mounds about the size of infants. His stomach turned. When he returned inside, the family had already wrapped the twins and laid them beside the bed. Moira was still and pale, alive, but barely. Brennan began to gather his instruments when he noticed something strange beneath the cot. A wooden box, half covered by a quilt. Out of instinct, or maybe dread, he pulled it free. Inside were journals. Dozens of them. Leather-bound, each labeled with a year. He opened one. The handwriting was meticulous. Notations of births, deaths, measurements, sketches of infants, crude anatomical drawings. Margins filled with phrases like fourth-generation subject, symmetry incomplete, divine adjustment unsuccessful. As he flipped through page after page, a sick realization crept over him. This wasn't a record of tragedy. It was data, controlled, documented, and studied. These people weren't victims of chance. They were participants in a plan that had been carried out for generations. In the final pages, he found a list of pairings, family members matched by bloodline, ages, and traits of purity. He turned to look at the family again, their silent, waiting faces, their stillness in the flickering lamplight. Dr. Brennan's hands shook as he closed the book. He wanted to leave, to run, to escape the oppressive air that seemed to hum with secrets. But something in him knew he couldn't. He was standing at the edge of something ancient and monstrous, a lineage that had turned faith into a laboratory and love into a breeding chart. These people had seen this before. They didn't fear it, they documented it. And as the night deepened over the Montana hills, Brennan realized the horror before him wasn't an accident of nature. It was a system, one built by human hands and sanctified in blood. Dr. Brennan lit another candle. The air in the cabin was thick with the smell of wax and decay. Around him, the Donnelly family had retreated into silence, sitting by the hearth like statues, their faces unreadable. On the small table, the journals lay open before him. He had seen medical records before, but never anything like this. The first pages were written in Gaelic, faded and trembling, as if copied by candlelight generations ago. Later entries shifted to English, precise, deliberate, clinical. Each book seemed to pass from one hand to another, from father to son, mother to daughter, spanning over 50 years of careful observation. The handwriting changed, but the purpose never did. Brennan turned a page and froze. A drawing of an infant, small, twisted, its limbs bent in unnatural symmetry. Notes surrounded the image. Male, 4th generation. Survived 2 days. Eyes clear. Spine imperfect. He turned another page, a pair of conjoined twins, sketched in charcoal with chilling accuracy. Beneath, in Bridges' steady script, no suffering. Offered to God with prayer. Page after page revealed the same cold pattern. Every child, every variation, every death catalogued, as though the family were keeping ledgers for a factory of flesh. And the language, that was what chilled him most. Words like adjustment, imperfection, elimination, but interwoven through them were fragments of scripture. The pure shall inherit the earth. Blood untainted is blood divine. It was as if they had built a theology out of genetics. One entry, written by Patrick himself, stood out. It read, "We do not kill. We cleanse. Mercy is not in letting the flawed live. It is in freeing them from sin. Through this, we become nearer to God." Brennan felt his hands shake. The candlelight trembled with him. He had come expecting childbirth, not to stumble upon a century of calculated madness. This was no frontier superstition, no accidental tragedy. It was deliberate. Generations of people twisting faith into a weapon, turning their own children into sacrifices in pursuit of purity. He flipped to the last journal. its pages newer, cleaner. The handwriting belonged to Moira, the young woman still unconscious on the bed. Her entries were shorter, hesitant. She wrote of guilt, of fear, of dreams where the babies speak. One final line at the end of her last entry read, "I hear them crying in the ground." Brennan closed the book and sat in silence. The wind outside pressed against the cabin walls, and for the first time, he thought he could hear faint echoes beneath it, the sound of small, distant voices carried through the earth. He looked around the room again, at the faces of the family, serene and detached, as though their souls had long since fled their bodies. His anger rose, but so did sorrow. These weren't monsters in the traditional sense. They were people who had been taught that cruelty was holy, that murder could be called mercy if written in a sacred hand. They wrote about mercy, Brennan whispered to himself, but practiced murder. And as he gathered the journals, and thought consumed him, someone had to carry these stories out of the woods. Someone had to make sure the world knew what the Donnellys had done in the name of purity. The storm that had lingered all week finally broke that night. Thunder rolled over the ridges, shaking the windows of the Donnelly cabin as Dr. Brennan stood before the hearth, clutching one of the journals in his trembling hand. Across from him sat Patrick Donnelly, gaunt and calm, his eyes lit by the fire's glow. Beside him, Bridge, the matriarch, held a rosary that clicked softly in her fingers. Brennan slammed the journal down on the table. "You call this mercy?" His voice cracked through the silence. "You call this faith?" Patrick didn't flinch. He looked up slowly, his tone almost paternal. "Doctor, you don't understand. We only end what cannot live. God sends them imperfect, and we return them to him pure. Would you rather they suffer?" Brennan's jaw tightened. "You're not ending suffering. You're creating it. You've murdered your own blood for generations, children who never had a chance to breathe." Bridge spoke then, her voice low, weary but unwavering. "No, Doctor. We've protected them. The world would never accept what comes from our wombs. Better they die with prayer than live with shame." The words twisted in Brennan's chest. He saw the sincerity in their eyes, the terrible peace of people who had long ago convinced themselves that cruelty was kindness. These weren't raving lunatics. They were believers. True believers. He turned toward the cot where the conjoined twins lay wrapped in linen. Their tiny chests rose and fell together, each breath shallower than the last. Brennan knelt beside them, feeling the faint pulse under his fingertips. "They could live," he whispered. "With care, with medicine, they might have a chance." Patrick's voice hardened. "And live as what, Doctor? A spectacle, a curse? You would keep them alive to suffer for your conscience." He leaned forward, his tone almost pleading. "We have done what must be done, generation after generation. It is not sin, it is mercy." Something inside Brennan broke. "No," he said, his voice shaking but fierce. "It's madness." He pointed toward the journals. "This ends tonight. I'll ride to Helena, bring the federal marshal if I must. You'll answer for what you've done." Patrick stood slowly, his face now stripped of calm. "You won't make it off this mountain." The words hung in the air, not a threat but a prophecy. And then, from the cot, a faint sound, a sigh, soft as wind. Brennan turned. The twins were still. The rise and fall of their small chests had stopped. The room fell silent except for the crackling fire. Bridge crossed herself, whispering, "God has spared them." Brennan felt his knees weaken. The storm outside seemed to echo the collapse inside him. Anger, pity, horror, all blending into a single numb ache. The line that had begun with Fergus Donnelly's delusion, that had stretched through decades of secrecy and sin, had ended in that breathless moment. They believed they were saving their bloodline, Brennan murmured, staring at the lifeless forms. But in truth they had destroyed it. Outside, the rain began to fall, washing the soil around the graves, erasing the footprints of the last generation of the Donnellys. When dawn broke over the Montana mountains, the storm had passed, but the silence it left behind felt even heavier. Dr. Brennan sat on the cabin's porch, exhausted and hollow. The cries that had echoed through the night were gone. Inside, the Donnelly home lay still, a mausoleum of failed dreams and self-inflicted ruin. By midday, Brennan began his work, not as a physician now, but as an investigator. The law would demand proof, and he intended to give it, even if it tore his soul apart. Behind the cabin, he found 11 small graves, each marked with crude wooden crosses, names faded or missing entirely. With the help of local authorities who arrived days later, Brennan ordered the ground exhumed. The findings confirmed what the journals had only hinted at: 23 children over 5 generations, all dead within hours or days of birth. Many bore signs of deformity or trauma. None had been buried with ceremony. The journals told the rest. Drawings, dates, and chillingly meticulous notes revealed a century-long breeding program that had begun with Fergus Donnelly in Ireland and evolved into something far darker in America. Brennan spent sleepless nights cross-referencing the entries, the same handwriting recurring across decades, the same words repeated like scripture: purity, mercy, perfection. When confronted with the evidence, Patrick Donnelly no longer protested. The fire in his voice was gone, replaced by the quiet defeat of a man who finally understood the enormity of what he'd done. "We were trying to build something better," he told Brennan, his eyes distant. "But every birth was worse than the last. Every death took a piece of us." The blood turned against itself. His confession was detailed, deliberate, and heartbreaking. He spoke of generations bound by duty to an idea: cousins marrying cousins, births hidden, children released when they failed to meet the family's sacred standard. He described the teachings passed down from Fergus, that the Irish could be purified, perfected, made strong again through control of blood. But by Patrick's time, the improvement had turned to disease, madness, and despair. The surviving children bore the cost most visibly. Seamus, the eldest, broke down completely during questioning, muttering about helping the little ones sleep. His mind was fractured beyond repair. Moira and Colleen, both traumatized and physically frail, spoke in whispers about being chosen to continue the bloodline. Their understanding of family warped into horror. Declan, the youngest, vanished from custody weeks later, slipping into the wilderness, never to be found. Bridge Donnelly's final pregnancy ended in tragedy. The child was stillborn, its body malformed beyond recognition. She bled for hours before succumbing, her rosary still in her hand. Patrick followed her days later, stricken by a sudden stroke that Brennan attributed to exhaustion, guilt, and the collapse of everything he'd believed. When the territorial authorities finally arrived, they found a case so monstrous that no precedent could contain it. The prosecutor struggled to name the crime. Was it murder, madness, a century of delusion? Brennan closed his report with a single line that echoed through the halls of medical history. By the time the law arrived, justice had already been done by the bloodline itself. The Donnelly homestead was silent for years after the family's deaths. The cabin, once filled with cries, prayers, and secrets, stood untouched, its windows shattered by wind, its roof sagging beneath winter snow. Locals refused to go near it. Hunters claimed they heard crying in the trees, the echo of infants carried on the mountain air. Others swore the earth around the graves never froze, no matter how deep the cold. But Dr. Brennan stayed, at least long enough to finish what he started. For months, he documented everything: the graves, the journals, the genealogical charts, and the confessions. His detailed medical report became one of the first professional studies to link inbreeding with congenital deformities and mental illness. Though published under a different title to conceal the family's name, the case would quietly shape the early understanding of genetics long before Mendel's theories gained traction. In medical circles, Brennan's writings were hailed as groundbreaking, but privately he was haunted. His later journals, found after his death in 1923, revealed a man tormented by guilt and disbelief. He dreamed of the twins, of Patrick's trembling confession, of Bridge's final prayers whispered through blood. He wrote, "We thought science would purify man, Instead, it showed us what happens when man tries to play God. The story of the Donnelly family began to spread through the American frontier. In mining camps, churchyards, and lonely taverns, whispers grew of the pure blood family, a clan that had tried to create perfection through blood and paid the ultimate price. Some said their descendants still lived, hidden deep in the mountains. Others believed the Donnelly curse fell upon anyone who disturbed their resting place. As years passed, the cabin decayed. Grass overtook the paths, and trees reclaimed the clearing. Only the small cemetery behind the house remained visible, the crude wooden crosses tilting under the sun. Each cross marked not a success in the pursuit of perfection, but a failure, a reminder of what happens when human arrogance replaces compassion. By the turn of the 20th century, the Donnelly case had become folklore, a dark parable told by frontier settlers about the dangers of obsession, isolation, and misguided faith. Teachers mentioned it in passing when warning their students about the perils of pseudoscience. Preachers used it as a sermon on pride. Scientists cited it as a cautionary tale of ethics ignored in pursuit of knowledge. But for the few who visited the site, historians, wanderers, or those drawn by curiosity, one image stayed with them. 11 small graves in a neat line, each one perfectly measured, perfectly ordered. Beneath the Montana sun, the crosses stood not as monuments of purity, but as warnings. Warnings carved into the earth itself, whispering the same truth Dr. Brennan had written in his final letter. In trying to create perfection, they erased what made them human. What drives a family to turn against its own blood in the name of perfection? Is it isolation, ignorance, or something far more human, the desire to control what should never be controlled? The story of the Donnelly family isn't just a tale of horror. It's a mirror, reflecting the parts of humanity we'd rather not see. A father who believed he was chosen, a mother who obeyed out of love and fear, a lineage that mistook suffering for purity and silence for salvation. For nearly a century, they lived in the shadows of the Montana mountains, convinced they were doing God's work. But what they created wasn't divine. It was a warning written in blood, a reminder that when faith loses empathy and science loses morality, both paths lead to the same destination, tragedy. Dr. Brennan's final words still echo through time. They sought perfection, but found only the proof of imperfection within themselves. His discovery reshaped early medical ethics, but it also left an open question that still lingers. How many other families, hidden by wilderness and time, believed the same lie? Could the Donnellys truly have been the only ones, or were they just the ones who were found? We look back at stories like these because they remind us that progress without compassion is just another form of madness. That knowledge without conscience can become cruelty dressed as purpose, and that sometimes the most terrifying experiments aren't done in laboratories, but in living rooms, in families, in the quiet corners of human belief. Maybe that's why the Donnelly story endures, because it asks us to look inward, to question not just what they did, but what we're capable of when we convince ourselves we're right. If you stood where Dr. Brennan stood that summer in 1876, staring at that cabin, those graves, that silence, what would you have done? Would you have turned away, reported them, or stayed? Trying to understand how a family could lose itself so completely in the name of creation. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Do you believe everything about the Donnellys was truly uncovered? Or could their secret have stretched even further into the frontier, buried beneath other names, other families, other generations? Because sometimes history only tells the part we're ready to hear. Thank you for watching. And if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe for more haunting true stories from America's forgotten past. Join me next time as we open another dark chapter of history, one the world tried to forget.